From New York, this is Democracy Now!
The mayor just recently had a fundraiser that was held in a wine cave full of crystals and served $900 a bottle wine. Think about who comes to that.
According to Forbes magazine, I am literally the only person on this stage who's not a millionaire or a billionaire. So if this is important, this is the problem with issuing purity tests you cannot yourself pass.
Within a day of President Trump's impeachment, the Democratic presidential candidates held their final debate of the year in Los Angeles.
2009, go back and look. I was on the opposite side of that with the Pentagon. The only reason I can speak to it now is because it's been published. It's been published thoroughly. I'm the guy from the beginning who argued that it was a big, big mistake to surge forces to Afghanistan.
Joe, you're also the guy who helped lead us into the disastrous war in Iraq. What we need to rethink is the entire war on terror.
We'll play highlights from the Democratic presidential debate and host a roundtable discussion on what the candidates were asked and not asked, which candidates were included in the debate and which were excluded. We'll speak with immigrant rights activist Erica Andiola, investigative war reporter Asmat Khan, Heather McGee of Demos, Kristen Clark with Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, and Alan Minsky of Progressive Democrats of America, who pushed for the debate to address poverty. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is continuing to delay sending the 2 articles of impeachment against President Trump to the Republican-controlled Senate, as she and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell sparred Thursday over her unprecedented move. In a historic vote Wednesday, the House of Representatives impeached President Trump for abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. But Pelosi then said she'd delay sending the charges to the Senate until she's certain there'll be a fair trial. Majority Leader McConnell has said he's not an impartial juror and has vowed to closely coordinate any impeachment trial with the White House. House lawmakers left Capitol Hill Thursday for a 2-week vacation, meaning the battle over sending the articles of impeachment will continue into the new year. This is House Speaker Nancy Pelosi speaking to reporters Thursday.
I was not prepared to put the managers in that bill yet because we don't know the arena that we are in. Frankly, I don't care what the Republicans say.
And this is Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell speaking from the floor of the Senate.
Some House Democrats imply they're withholding the articles for some kind of leverage so they can dictate the Senate process to senators. I admit, I'm not sure what leverage there is in refraining from sending us something we do not want. Meanwhile, other House Democrats seem to be suggesting they'd prefer never to transmit the articles. Fine with me.
In more news on impeachment, the most influential evangelical magazine, Christianity Today, has turned against Trump in an editorial headlined, "Trump Should Be Removed from Office." The magazine, founded by the evangelical leader Billy Graham, accused Trump of having a grossly immoral character. And on Thursday, President Trump met with New Jersey Congressmember Jefferson Van Drew at the White House after Van Drew announced he would switch parties and become a Republican following his decision to vote against impeaching President Trump. 7 Democratic presidential candidates took the stage for a televised debate Thursday night at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. During the debate, the onstage candidates Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Joe Biden, Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, Tom Steyer, and Andrew Yang spoke about impeachment, money in politics, immigration, the economy, climate change, health care, and education. Meanwhile, offstage, 2 prominent presidential candidates of color, Cory Booker and Julian Castro, ran ads during the debate to remind voters that though they weren't included, they're still in the race. The Democratic National Committee has come under fierce criticism for its debate criteria, which excluded Booker and Castro from the debate stage Thursday night. After headlines, we'll spend the rest of the hour hosting a roundtable discussion and playing highlights of Thursday's debate. The Senate passed a $1.4 trillion spending package Thursday to avoid a government shutdown. The package includes a $738 billion defense bill, one of the most expensive military bills in U.S. history. The spending package also includes $1.4 billion for Trump's border wall and allocates $25 million for gun violence research for the first time in 20 years. The House has passed the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the USMCA, the replacement for NAFTA, or the 1994 North American Free Trade Agreement. The new deal includes stronger labor and environmental provisions. American labor groups have backed the deal. This is AFL-CIO Labor Union President Richard Trumka.
It's going to take a few years to begin to reverse the bad and the evil that was done by NAFTA, the harm that was done to our economy and to the manufacturing sector in our economy and to other sectors as well. So it's going to take 8, 10, 12 years for this process to work through and reverse itself. But you never get to the end product if you don't start somewhere.
The original North American Free Trade Agreement took effect in '94, devastating the livelihood of small farmers across Mexico. In Lebanon, President Michel Aoun has named a former education minister and university professor as the next prime minister after massive anti-government protests forced Prime Minister Saad Hariri to resign in late October. Hassan Diab is a professor at the American University of Beirut who is backed by Christian and Shiite political parties, including Hezbollah. On Thursday, crowds poured into the streets of Beirut and other cities to protest Diab's nomination. This is Marwa Al-Bacha in Beirut.
We are here today because we are not satisfied with the newly imposed prime minister that was imposed without our consent nor the consent of many in Lebanon. We went to the streets to make our voice heard.
In Brazil, the number of people killed by police is soaring. Last year, the police killed an average of 17 people every single day, according to official government data. But human rights activists say off-duty and retired police officers also regularly carry out extrajudicial killings as part of a state-sanctioned war on crime stoked by Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro, who has said criminals should, quote, die like cockroaches. In Sudan, hundreds of thousands of people poured into the streets across the country to mark the first anniversary of the mass popular uprising that ousted longtime ruler Omar al-Bashir. The protesters demanded justice for those killed during the popular protests last year and vowed to continue the political revolution. This is Fatma Ali.
Thank God the revolution is moving toward the right direction, but there's still more to be done in the state. We're asking about all those responsible. Where are they and why aren't they being punished? Those who are corrupt, such as the former president Omar al-Bashir. He should not be treated like a president. Al-Bashir belongs on trial at The Hague.
In Washington state, Republicans are calling on their fellow Republican lawmaker Matt Shea to step down after a new report commissioned by the Washington State House Republicans found Shea participated in domestic terrorism. The report found Shea planned, engaged in, and promoted armed conflicts of political violence against the U.S. government between 2014 and 2016 as a leader of the anti-government Patriot movement. The report also says Representative Matt Shea has cultivated close ties with armed anti-government militias since being elected in 2008. Shea is resisting calls to resign, writing on Facebook Thursday night, quote, "I will not back down. Stand strong, fellow patriots," unquote. And Amazon is facing criticism over its home security camera and smart home product called Ring after a data leak exposed the personal information of over 3,000 users. The data breach first exposed by BuzzFeed News includes emails, passwords, and other sensitive information that would allow hackers to access live camera footage from inside every room of people's homes. The data breach follows criticism over Ring's cooperation with more than 400 police departments, giving police the ability to use homeowners' camera footage in their investigations. In October, a group of 30 civil rights groups published a joint letter demanding lawmakers stop the police partnership, calling it a threat to civil rights and liberties, especially for Black and brown communities. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Within a day of President Trump's impeachment, the Democratic presidential candidates held their final debate of the year at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. The debate was almost put on hold when the candidates vowed to boycott it if a labor dispute between a food workers union, Unite Here Local 11, and the company Sodexo was not resolved. Negotiators announced on Tuesday they'd reached a tentative contract agreement. With the lead-off presidential caucuses in Iowa just 6.5 weeks away, candidates traded barbs and jokes, such as this exchange after moderator Tim Alberta of Politico asked them to respond to former President Obama, who recently said women were better leaders and old men needed to get out of the way. Alberta noted Senator Bernie Sanders was the oldest candidate on stage and then had this exchange with Senator Elizabeth Warren.
Senator Warren, you would be the oldest president ever inaugurated. I'd like you to weigh in as well.
I'd also be the youngest woman ever inaugurated.
Joining Senators Warren and Sanders on stage were Senator Amy Klobuchar, South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg, former Vice President Joe Biden, billionaire Tom Steyer, and Andrew Yang. This is Amna Nawaz, the first Pakistani-American and first Muslim-American to moderate a presidential primary debate, questioning Yang about being the only non-white candidate on the stage.
The Democratic Party relies on Black, Hispanic, and Asian voters, but you are the only candidate of color on the stage tonight, and the entire field remains overwhelmingly white. What message do you think this sends to voters of color?
It's both an honor and disappointment to be the lone candidate of color on the stage tonight. I miss Kamala, I miss Cory, though I think Cory will be back. I grew up the son of immigrants, and I had many racial epithets used against me as a kid. But Black and Latinos have something much more powerful working against them than words. They have numbers. The average net worth of a Black household is only 10% that of a white household. For Latinos, it's 12%. If you're a Black woman, you're 320% more likely to die from complications in childbirth. These are the numbers that define race in our country. And the question is, why am I the lone candidate of color on this stage? Fewer than 5% of Americans donate to political campaigns. You know what you need to donate to political campaigns? Disposable income.
That's presidential candidate Andrew Yang. Today, we host a roundtable discussion on the debate and the issues that came up, including immigration, climate, even for the first time, the rights of transgender women of color. We'll also look at who and what was left out and who was and was not on the stage. We begin in Washington, D.C., with Kristen Clark, President and Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Kristen Clark, welcome back to Democracy Now! Your response overall to the debate last night, and then this specific point, which was who was not on the stage. Candidates of color, Kamala Harris has pulled out of the race, and of course, then Cory Booker and Julian Castro, who are both still presidential candidates, excluded from this debate.
Yeah, the elephant in the room last night during the debate was the fact that virtually all of the candidates of color have been wiped out by the rules, the restrictions, and the norms governing this process, but for Yang. I think that this is a moment that requires us to press pause and have a conversation about money in politics, about racially polarized voting patterns in our country. We've never had a woman serve as president, but we've also never had a person we also deserve to have a process that yields a person of color on the ticket. And, you know, it is very clear that white privileged candidates with tremendous amounts of personal wealth enjoy an unnatural advantage in this process. I was glad to see some of the interviewers force a conversation about this very issue. There was a moment where the question was presented to Bernie Sanders, who started to divert a bit and talk about climate change. And the interviewer said, no, I'm asking you a very explicit question about race. So we need to make sure that as the slate becomes whiter, that we're still forcing the conversation about race and racism in our country, and really pushing these candidates to articulate their position on issues that matter to African Americans in this country. At the end of the day, if we want energized turnout and participation among African Americans and Latinos, we have to make sure that the issues that matter to our communities are not wiped out from this debate. We need to make sure that this debate is not whitewashed at the end of the day.
So 2020 presidential candidate, New Jersey Senator Cory Booker, may not have been invited on the debate stage last night, but he did use the debate to run his first televised campaign ad. It ran on cable in 22 markets, including in the 4 states that vote in February: Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and South Carolina, as well as in Washington, New York, and Los Angeles, the host city for the debate. The 30-second spot is part of a $500,000 digital and television ad buy. This is part of it.
How long are these things? 30 seconds? Are you sure we can afford this? You're only going to see this ad once because I'm not a billionaire. I won't be on tonight's debate stage, but that's okay because I'm going to win this election anyway. This election isn't about who can spend the most or who slings the most mud. It's about the people. It's about all of us standing together, fighting together, not just to beat Donald Trump, but to bring about the transformative change we need. Go to CoryBooker.com. Join us. I'm Cory Booker, and I approve this message.
So, Kristen Clark, you got to pay to play. He had to pay to get into that debate. He was the commercial in between the floor debate.
Yeah. And hey, Yang said that he thinks that Senator Booker will be back. I think it's very clear that he's not going away. He's finding alternative ways to get his voice out there. But again, it really forces us to take a step back and say, why is it that this debate stage is becoming whiter and more male? And I think it should force us to take a step back and think about the rules, the norms, the restrictions, the undue influence of money, privilege, and power, and how that's locking out voices of color from this process. I'm happy that Senator Booker is finding ways to connect with the electorate and get his message out there. But as we go into a new decade, into 2020, and think about what it'll take to build a true multiracial democracy in our country, we have to be deeply concerned about the fact that this stage, as broad as it was, is getting wider and more male by the day.
Last month, I co-moderated the first ever presidential forum on environmental justice at South Carolina State University in Orangeburg. And I asked presidential candidate Elizabeth Warren about the role of the order of the primaries.
Speaking about racial injustice, do you think the order of the primary states should change? You have Iowa and New Hampshire, 2 of the whitest states in the country. And then we move to South Carolina with a very significant population of people of color. And it means the candidates spend so much of their time catering to those first 2 states. Overall, do you think that should change?
Look, I'm just a player in the game on this one.
That's Elizabeth Warren responding last month in a presidential forum we held in South Carolina. I wanted to bring Erica Andiola into the debate. Erica works with the group Raices, an immigrants' rights group. Can you respond to this issue of the two of the whitest states determining, 2 of the whitest states being the first 2 primary and caucuses?
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't help the case for people of color in many ways. We saw, I mean, your other guest also is really speaking to the fact that the more and more that, we advance through time in the debates and more people of color are left out. I definitely missed, Julian Castro last night. I missed Cory Booker. And, the reason, and in some ways I disagree a lot with Kamala Harris, but in some ways it's also important to see women of color in there. And it was not great to see that, sometimes some candidates were asked about issues, especially about either race or immigration. Criminal justice reform didn't come out as much, and either, they changed the topic many times or just the topic doesn't come up at all. So it has a huge impact on how they're trying to cater to the first states. And most of them spend most of their time in Iowa right now, where there's a community, there's, a Latino community, there's a very small community of people of color compared to Nevada and other states, but it makes a difference in the way that they are really talking about the issues in probably by the beginning of the year, they're not going to talk too much about immigration and other issues that people of color care about.
In fact, we spoke to the head of the Texas Democratic Party, who said that he's been trying to hold a presidential forum in Texas, and the candidates just keep saying, and this is particularly significant because of how long the lead up to the first primaries and caucuses are, that these candidates say, no, we've got to do the first debate with the first states. And of course, Julian Castro has called for a change in the order. But I wanted to go to the issue specifically of immigration, to turn to a clip of Senator Bernie Sanders addressing his plans for immigration reform.
Senator Sanders, a related question to you. Actually, Senator Sanders, I have a new question for you. You can respond to Mr. Yang's comments as well.
Respond to the immigration question?
This is related, sir, but there are estimated to be as many as 12 million undocumented immigrants in the U.S., more than 2 million right here in California. If you have a chance to forge a bipartisan immigration reform plan, would you insist on a path to citizenship for all 12 million or just a segment of that population?
No, this is what I would do. Day one, executive order, restore the legal status of 1.8 million young people in the DACA program. Day one, we change border policy so that federal agents will never snatch babies from the arms of their mothers. Day one, we introduce bipartisan legislation, which will in fact be comprehensive, which will result in a path toward citizenship for all of the 11 million who are undocumented. That is what the people of our country want.
That was Senator Bernie Sanders answering the question of PBS moderator Amna Nawaz, who's the first Muslim American to moderate a presidential debate. She also asked former Vice President Joe Biden if he supports reparations for the children who've been separated from their families at the U.S.-Mexico border. This was Biden's response.
Vice President Biden, do you support reparations?
Look, let me, since I haven't spoken on this, got a chance. Number one, the reason we're the country we are is because of immigration. We've been able to cherry pick the best from every single continent. The people who come here have determination, resilience. They are ready to stand up and work like the devil. We have 24 out of every 100 children in our school today is Hispanic. The idea that we are going to walk away and not provide every opportunity for them is not only stupid and immoral, but it's bad for America. They are the future of America, and we should invest in them. Everybody will benefit from it, every single American, and you should get used to it. This is a nation of immigrants. That's who we are. That's why we're who we are. That's what makes us different, and we should invest in them.
Eric Andiola, Chief Advocacy Officer for RAISIS, the Refugee and Immigrant Rights, the Refugee and Immigrant Center for Education and Legal Services in Phoenix. Can you respond to both of these issues?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, first of all, that I'm really happy that immigration came up this time around. In the past, few debates, the issue didn't even come up, and if it did, it was, a very tiny question to Elizabeth Warren that didn't really get much of an answer as much as we needed. And I would say that Bernie's in the right direction. I think Bernie's absolutely right. We cannot wait, to ask for comprehensive immigration reform right away as soon as, the hopefully a Democratic presidential candidate wins, and we have a different administration. We don't want them to focus just on passing a big, bill as soon as they come into office, because they can do a lot on day one. And that's what Bernie said. On day one, he would do a lot of what he can to change the policies that first the Trump administration has enacted, but also that the Obama administration had also had in place, deporting millions of people. And so at the same time as this was happening, there was immigrant rights organizations outside of the debate pushing for what we're calling the migrant justice platform. And it's really a push for a new direction on immigration, that we're not just stuck talking about passing this big bill as soon as, the Democrats get elected, because Obama did that. He promised this really big bill, and he also deported a lot of people. And so we need a new direction. We need day one, as Bernie said, we need executive action, and we need the migrant justice platform to be enacted as soon as possible.
It's interesting to point out that December 18th, the day President Trump was impeached, was National Migrant Day. Erica, also outside the protest, outside the debate yesterday, immigrants were protesting.
That's correct. There was people who were there to ask and to pressure the Democratic Party to take, again, a new direction on this issue. There has been a lot of conversations, again, about, what can we do as a nation with immigrants? And I know that Democrats, have a lot to apologize for. I think they should be apologizing, especially Joe Biden, working in the Obama administration, because the fact was that they did. Of course, they gave us, Obama gave us DACA because we pressure him so much as undocumented youth and dreamers. But, a lot of people also got deported. There were millions of people who got deported, and this was a Democratic president. And so we need, again, a promise from Joe Biden and from other candidates that they're not going to do the same, and that they're going to push for all of the policies that Trump has enacted right now that has hurt so many people to be undone, and all the harm to be undone. But also, yes, of course, reparations to the children who were separated, and make sure that we bring back all the people who were deported unjustly under the Obama administration and the Trump administration.
Eric Andiola of Rises, thanks so much for being with us. As we continue our roundtable, we're going to look at the issue of war and peace coming back as we look at the last debate that's taking place this year of the Democratic presidential candidates. Stay with us.
Don't get down. Don't waste time on things that you can't ever change. I know we all do. Write a song. All your new ones are the best you've ever sung. Write another one. And that old scene. Come back when you feel the need. Well, I'll be here for you.
Don't Get Down by Hayden. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman as we spend the hour on the final Democratic presidential debate of the year, held at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. We're going to turn right now to the PBS moderator, Yamiche Alcindor, who questioned Senator Warren about Guantanamo Bay.
President Obama pledged to close the detention camp at Guantanamo Bay, but could not. 40 prisoners remain there. Last year, U.S. taxpayers paid $540 million to keep Guantanamo open. Would you pledge to finally close the detention facility? And if elected, how will you do it?
Yes, it's time to close this detention facility. It not only costs us money, it is an international embarrassment. We have to be an America that lives our values every single day. We can't be an America that stands up and asks people to fight alongside us, as we did with the Kurds in fighting ISIS, and then turn around in the blink of a tweet and say that we're turning our backs on the people who stood beside us. After that, who wants to be an ally of the United States? We have to be an America that understands the difference and recognizes the difference between our allies, the people who will work alongside us, and the dictators who would do us harm. And we need to treat our allies better than we treat the dictators.
Vice President Biden, why couldn't you close Guantanamo Bay? Why couldn't the Obama administration close Guantanamo Bay?
We attempted to close Guantanamo Bay, but you have to have congressional authority to do it. They've kept it open. And the fact is that we, in fact, think it's the greatest, it is an advertisement for creating terror. Look, what we have done around the world in terms of keeping Guantanamo open, or what Trump has done by no longer being an honest broker in Israel, there's no solution for Israel other than a two-state solution. It does not exist. It's not possible to have a Jewish state in the Middle East without there being a two-state solution. And he has played to all the same fears and all the prejudices that exist that in this country and in Israel. Bibi Netanyahu and I know one another well. He knows that I think what he's doing is outrageous. What we do is we have to put pressure constantly on the Israelis to move to a two-state solution, not withdraw physical aid from them in terms of their security.
That was Vice President Joe Biden being questioned by PBS moderator Yamiche Alcindor. We're joined right now by Asmat Khan, who is an award-winning investigative reporter, New York Times Magazine contributing writer, a Future of War Fellow at the New America Foundation. Her investigations into U.S. wars have taken her to Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Syria, currently writing a book about America's so-called precision airstrikes. Thanks so much for being with us. Can you respond to everything from the Israel-Palestine conflict to Guantanamo?
Right. So this question about Guantanamo was one that was big during the 2008 election. And we've heard very little talk about Guantanamo in recent years. And that's because the American public largely believes that the U.S. is no longer involved in the detention of so-called terrorism suspects. And the reality is very different than that. While there are a few people left in Guantanamo and the United States is struggling with what to do with them, the reality is that someone is running prisons that the U.S. no longer maintains in countries like Iraq and Syria and in places like Afghanistan. And that is the U.S. is now relying on partner governments, on allied governments, on partner forces, for example, Kurds in Syria, who are running these prisons and holding these suspects. And torture and abuse are widespread in some of these prisons. We may not be talking about it. It may not be an agenda issue, but detainee and torture and policy related to that should be a major issue for candidates to be talking about, because it is something that continues to happen and is not being discussed particularly with respect to ISIS. Iraq and Syria are filled with sprawling prisons. Some of them include children of families who have been accused of involvement in ISIS, and there's very little discussion about what to do with them. The abuse that I mentioned that's happening in these places, if we look at recent history, we know that these have had devastating consequences, often serving as incubators for groups like ISIS, and there's very little discussion about what to do with them, particularly when it comes to the repatriation of, ISIS fighters who came from Western countries. The United States needs a clear policy on this, and it's not something that candidates are talking about. This discussion about detention has been relegated to the issue of Guantanamo and a few prisoners, but it's much bigger than that. And that torture discussion really warrants serious debate.
In Israel-Palestine, and overall, your assessment of the questions that were asked last night on these issues?
Yeah, these questions came up briefly, and there were some answers. And so I think with the Israel-Palestine question, Bernie Sanders came to say that we don't need to just be pro-Israel, we need to be pro-Palestinian as well. Biden came forward to say that, he criticizes Bibi Netanyahu and what he's doing and that there needs to be a two-state solution. But what that actually would turn into, there were very few specifics. So there really isn't much to dig into here when it comes to what a real policy forward would look like, what kind of pressure that Biden said needed to be put on Israel. What does that pressure actually look like, particularly when he said that, military or security aid should not be off the table? You need to really illustrate what those pressure points are, and he didn't actually do that.
Well, I want to turn to Afghanistan now. Last week, the Washington Post published confidential documents that revealed for years senior U.S. officials misled the public about the war in Afghanistan. I want to turn to a clip of PBS moderator Amna Nawaz questioning, again, Vice President Joe Biden about whether he withheld information about the war during his time as vice president under President Obama in the White House.
Mr. Biden, the question was about your time in the White House, though. And
I'm talking about the White House.
In that Washington Post report, there's a senior national security official who said that there was constant pressure from the Obama White House to produce figures showing the troop surge was working, and I'm quoting from the report here, despite hard evidence to the contrary. What do you say to that?
Since 2009, go back and look. I was on the opposite side of that with the Pentagon. The only reason I can speak to it now is because it's been published. It's been published thoroughly. I'm the guy from the beginning who argued that it was a big, big mistake to surge forces to Afghanistan, period. We should not have done it. And I argued against it constantly.
Senator Sanders, you had your hand up?
Well, in all due respect to Joe, you're also the guy who helped lead us into the disastrous war in Iraq. What we need to do is, I think, rethink, and the Washington Post piece was very educational. What we need to rethink is the entire war on terror. We have lost thousands of our own men and women, brave soldiers. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people have been killed abroad or forced to leave their countries. It is time right now that we bring this world together to try to end these endless wars and address the root causes which are causing these wars.
That's Senator Bernie Sanders, and before that, former Vice President Joe Biden. Asmat Khan.
So what we heard here was Biden refer back to an effort he made in 2009 to promote something that's referred to as the Biden plan or as the zero option, this idea that he argued for, against the advice of military generals, that the United States should scale back its footprint. These ground troops in Afghanistan focus more exclusively on counterterrorism operations and U.S. Special Forces. It's something he pushed for and didn't win back in 2009. He failed to persuade Obama to do that. And he says this is the kind of approach he would bring now. But there's a massive misconception here. This implies that somehow war operations would decrease. The reality is that most combat operations today are conducted not by ground troops. They're actually conducted via airstrikes. There have been more bombs dropped in Afghanistan when U.S. troop levels have been lower than they were at their surge in 2011. In 2011, we saw around 5,000 bombs dropped in Afghanistan. In 2018, when troop levels are set at some of their lowest, we saw more than 7,000 bombs dropped. And same with this year. We've seen that escalated. So what there is, and what even any kind of a zero option would have included, was an acceleration in the pace of airstrikes. And these airstrikes have devastating consequences on civilians. More civilians have been killed in the war in Afghanistan this year than in any year of U.S. history in this war, in these 18 years of war. So what we're seeing is a reality in which there is a belief, a mistaken belief, that ending the war comes down to removing troops on the ground, when the reality is that most of these wars are being carried out via airstrikes, and whoever the next president is, whoever these candidates are who are trying to shape or talk about, a mantra we're hearing a lot of, ending endless war, will need to have a very specific policy when it comes to airstrikes. It's not just about ground troops. That's an erroneous misconception that comes up again and again. And it's interesting because, we heard Sanders as well here talk about ending endless wars. If you look at the foreign policy statements of each of these Democratic candidates, they are more or less in a similar vein, with one exception, and that so far has been Sanders, who I think in June issued a sort of lengthy piece on ending endless wars and foreign affairs, in which he sort of spelled out what it would take to get there, and it distinguished him from many of the other candidates on stage, none of whom have really articulated a clear vision on what it would take to end endless war.
I mean, it's interesting. CNN just released a poll that said it's Bernie Sanders, who is the most popular Democratic presidential candidate right now. But on this issue of his challenge to Biden, you had Biden together with Senator Clinton, who voted to authorize the Iraq war back in 2002, the vote for authorization.
Right. That war vote. So if you look at what Biden's statements on his Iraq war vote, he has oscillated in describing what his thinking was at the time. But there are many who voted to authorize voted for the Iraq war who have now come back and since said, you know, I don't think I made the right decision. We didn't have the right information. It's one where there's a lot of political leeway in expressing regret. The Afghanistan war vote has not had that same kind of regret. So it was interesting to hear Sanders say last night that that was a vote he regretted. That war vote was far less controversial. And it's interesting to hear people talk.
Interesting to go back to the one person who said no, and that was Barbara Lee.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And so she is the one person who said no, who is now being talked about by these other candidates for that vote. And it's coming up in the context of a reconsidering of the authorization for the use of military force. And this is something Pete Buttigieg brought up last night. He said that he was reflecting on his war experience. He was saying, you know, I'm surprised it's gone on for this long. I would propose, you know, a 3-year limit on these kinds of these authorizations for force. And the implication here that he's making is that had there been some kind of a 3-year limit in which Congress would have to revote on the war in Afghanistan, that maybe we wouldn't be in that war today. And I don't think that stacks up with reality. If you look at congressional leaders, if you look at senators, congressional leaders on the Afghanistan war, it has been relatively bipartisan when it comes to an understanding of troop levels, when it comes to an understanding of what the United States should be doing in the country. The only real shakeup we've seen when it comes to that war has been under the Trump administration as the United States pursued negotiations with the Taliban. So I don't think, you know, while it may be worthy to reconsider the AUMF and to hear candidates talk about it, to assume that that would have ended the Afghanistan war, I think is a mistake.
Well, I want to thank you, Asmat Khan, award-winning investigative reporter, New York Times Magazine contributing writer, Future of War fellow at the New America Foundation. Her investigations into U.S. wars have taken her to Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Syria. Currently writing a book about America's so-called precision airstrikes. She mentioned Pete Buttigieg. We are going to hear him and Elizabeth Warren spar over who pays for the candidates. Winegate, you might say. Stay with us. Crossbones Style by Cat Power. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report, as we spend the hour on the Democratic presidential debate in Los Angeles Thursday night, the last one of the year. One of the most heated exchanges of the evening came when Senator Elizabeth Warren criticized South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg for holding a closed-door fundraiser in what she called a wine cave.
The mayor just recently had a fundraiser that was held in a wine cave full of crystals and served $900 a bottle wine. Think about who comes to that.
According to Forbes magazine, I am literally the only person on this stage who's not a millionaire or a billionaire. So this is important. This is the problem with issuing purity tests you cannot yourself pass.
I do not sell access to my time.
I want to bring Heather McGhee into this discussion, distinguished senior fellow and former president of Demos, now at Demos Action. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Heather. It's great to have you with us. So this is going to become the meme of the night, right? Wine cave.
Wine cave, Pete,
and
yes.
the crystal that was dangling above. Can you talk about the significance of what Elizabeth Warren raised and also what Pete Buttigieg raised, that I'm the only non-millionaire billionaire on this stage tonight?
Yeah, that was probably his strongest way to deflect from what is a major issue. And it's a major issue, this question about how these candidates are running their campaign, who they're giving access to, who's got their ear, and therefore, you know, what shape it's going to have on the policymaking. You know, Mayor Pete tried to make the point that Elizabeth Warren started out her career in politics by doing the same kind of fundraising that everybody else does. The only difference here that I think, you know, Senator Warren didn't actually say this, but if you think about who these two people are, is that Senator Warren came into politics and it was very clear what her values were, right? She came into politics on the heels of the financial crisis, of standing up the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, of holding people like Jamie Dimon and Tim Geithner accountable, of not being afraid to make enemies even with Democrats on issues of, you know, inequality. Pete Buttigieg is more of a cipher, right? He is someone whom a lot of different people, including a lot of billionaires, think this is the kind of moderate we can get behind. This is the kind of moderate maybe we can influence. So that's really the question, right?
He also raised that, although she's saying she's not having these, you know, closed-door, big fundraiser dinners or donor calls, that she only recently made that decision and that she was able to take her Senate finances, the money she raised doing just that, and move it into her presidential campaign.
And I think, you know, you saw later on she had a sit-down with the with the CNN panel, and Van Joes and David Axelrod really tried to pin her on this. And she said basically, this is a question of not a purity test, but people in America want to see that you're trying. And, you know, I think what she was trying to say there is that she's trying to influence the way Democrats are running their campaigns now on the biggest scale of a campaign she's ever done. And then the question is policy, right? It's very different for Elizabeth Warren to come out there and say, I want a wealth tax, you know, I want to, you know, fundamentally break up big companies, versus Pete, who's saying, I think Medicare for all goes too far. I think free college goes too far. That's the issue. That didn't land in the debate, but it's very different for someone who's still having closed-door fundraisers, still raising from billionaires, who's also being softer on economic inequality.
I wanted to bring Alan Minsky into this discussion, because after Senator Warren and as well Pete Buttigieg sparred over this issue of donors. We're going to go to a clip right now. After they sparred over big dollar donors, Sanders weighed in too.
I am rather proud, maybe, I don't know, the only candidate up here doesn't have any billionaire contributions. But you know what I do have? We have received more contributions from more individuals than any candidate in the history of the United States of America at this point in an election, averaging $18 apiece. Now, there's a real competition going on up here. My good friend Joe, and he is a good friend, he's received contributions from 44 billionaires. Pete, on the other hand, is trailing, Pete. You only got 39 billionaires contributing. So, Pete, we look forward to you. I know you're an energetic guy and a competitive guy, to see if you could take on Joe on that issue.
So joining us now from Los Angeles with Heather McGhee is Alan Minsky, Executive Director of Progressive Democrats of America. His latest piece in The Nation is headlined, "The Democratic Presidential Debate Must Address Poverty." So what's your grade for them last night, Alan?
Obviously a straight F, and they've received a straight F now through 6 rounds of debates and 8 total debates. The word poverty has yet to be mentioned by a moderator. This is not a matter just of semantics. I went through all of the previous debate transcripts and looked for the words poor, look for the words poverty, look for the word homeless, and only poor has been mentioned by any of the moderators. Once it was mentioned in the context of poverty in a question to Bill de Blasio in the first round of debates, where it was sort of a gotcha question about the wealth inequality levels in New York City. And the only other time that poor was mentioned is when Anderson Cooper asked Joe Biden if his son had poor judgment. So it's a complete erasure of the reality of the lives of tens of millions of Americans, because there are 38 million people below the poverty level, which is set at such a ridiculously low level that you really have to consider people who are at the poverty level or near the poverty level. And in the United States right now, according to the latest 2018 census statistics that have been released, that's 40% of the population, and yet there's no consideration about poverty issues, the lives of the poor. And in Los Angeles, California, I really thought that this would be broken last night, because in a poll in the Los Angeles Times on November 14th, 2019, just 35 days ago, Los Angelenos ranked homelessness as, far and away the top issue facing them. And there's just an epidemic of homelessness here. And to come to Los Angeles and make no reference to it, I think was an incredible failing by the moderators. But again, not unexpected.
Despite not qualifying for the debate, 2020 presidential candidate Julian Castro was in Los Angeles this week. On Wednesday, he toured LA's Skid Row to speak to unhoused people about the housing crisis. He tweeted last night, quote, "How in the world did we just have a presidential debate in Los Angeles, the epicenter of a national housing and homelessness crisis, without a single question about housing opportunity?" Your response, Alan?
Absolutely, and I think it's worth saying that, of course, the
Castro,
candidates, a few of them have brought up poverty and the poor and homelessness across the debates. And going back to the earlier conversation with the first guest on today's show, Cory Booker and Julian Castro were two of the candidates who had brought up poverty and homelessness in previous debates. Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders haven't. And last night, actually, Pete Buttigieg, I was actually left wondering if he'd read my article. He actually spoke specifically about how he made reference to the fact that basically political advisors will tell candidates not to mention the word poverty. You're supposed to talk about the middle class. And again, this puts the lives of basically half the population of the United States under erasure. And these are, complex issues around how we've gotten to this situation where there are so many homeless people, so many people living in dire poverty in the United States, and to not have the Democratic candidates answer questions about what their programs would be, what their policies, is a tremendous failure. And it really goes towards the hosts of these debates, and I think also the Democratic National Committee, because they sort of set the framing for the debates. And this is a long-standing thing that's gone on in Democratic Party politics from the age of Reagan forward, where it's viewed as a losing issue to talk about poverty. And I think that it's time, especially in an era in which candidates like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren have really painted a picture of the American economy not working for the average household. Well, what are those households experiencing? They're experiencing poverty or fear of poverty, and all the way to fear of homelessness is a real consideration in their lives. That puts incredible stress on people. And I do want to say this, too. When people talk about, emotional issues in American society and in the world, people just now talk about homelessness as a fact of American life. Just how traumatic this experience is for the people who go through homelessness in Southern California and across the country is so profound. And there's just no consideration of this by the political class. And there's so much dimension to how this needs to be addressed, how poverty needs to be addressed. We need to hear from the people who want to be the presidents of the United States, particularly from the Democratic Party, about these issues. And again, it's just crickets. We hear nothing from the moderators, no asking for details on these issues.
Heather McGhee, you have long written about and have been an activist around the issue of inequality. What about the stance of the Democratic and Republican establishment on this? And also, last night, climate change was addressed, but climate justice, this whole idea of who is affected the most, both by climate, by pollution, environmental injustice, where plants get sited, et cetera.
This issue is the defining issue of our time, the issue of inequality. Inequality which is created by inequality in our democracy, and that inequality of voice is the major thing stopping our country from acting in our own best interest to save the planet and to create an economic transformation that could be huge for our children's generation and could be huge right now. These inequalities that compound on one another, some people talk about it in terms of corruption, the idea that just a handful of fossil fuel companies could have a vice grip on an entire political party, which is basically changing the planetary course of history. The idea that the inequality of voice is making it so that you've got half of American families who are living paycheck to paycheck, who are under threat of homelessness, who are seeing jobs have to be sort of added together and are absolutely vulnerable to pretty much every major cost: childcare, healthcare, housing, transportation, right? A carburetor could put you into homelessness if it breaks on your car. This is the kind of precarity that we've been waiting for a long time. Activists have been pushing for a long time to see a Democratic standard bearer make this the focal point of their campaign.
Now, of course, one did, right? Washington Governor Inslee, and called for a debate specifically on the climate crisis. Right. And so the Democratic Party, at least the DNC, cast themselves specifically against that and simply said no.
It was really unbelievable. I mean, what could be more important than talking about the way that our current politics and our current economy are unsustainable for the planet? You know, this idea of a Green New Deal has shot heart and light into the climate debate in this country. You've got young people getting tattoos that say, I'm Generation G and D, right? This is something that has managed to capture the imagination of millions of people all over the world. But it's an old idea. It's an idea rooted in economic justice. The idea that the people who have been, first in line for pollution should be the first in line for the economic transformation that is to come.
I wanted to go to a first-time issue raised in terms of the moderators. That is the violence against transgender women of color, brought up for the first time by a moderator last night. PBS's Yamiche Alcindor asked candidates how they, as president, would protect trans lives, and this was Senator Warren's response.
The transgender community has been marginalized in every way possible. And one thing that the President of the United States can do is lift up attention, lift up their voices, lift up their lives. Here's a promise I make. I will go to the Rose Garden once every year to read the names of transgender women, of people of color who have been killed in the past year. I will make sure that we read their names so that as a nation, we are forced to address the particular vulnerability on homelessness. I will change the rules now that put people in prison based on their birth sex identification rather than their current identification. I will do everything I can to make sure that we are in America that leaves no one behind.
We have less than 30 seconds, but Heather McGhee.
But this is a clear contrast between the Republicans and the Democrats. Republicans ran on trying to make sure that trans children in schools, were misidentified and had to go to the wrong bathroom. It's great to see the Democratic Party lifting up some of the most marginalized people in the country.
And finally, back to where we began with Kristen Clark of Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. As impeachment happened this week, as the debate happened, you still have Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell pushing through 11 federal district court judge nominations, the significance of the changing of the federal court.
Biggest issues, I think, of the Trump era, and one that we will be wrestling with for decades. President Trump, with the complicity of Senator McConnell, has managed to transform the judiciary by appointing judges, one, who don't reflect the diversity of our country, two, whose views and ideological positions are extreme and outside the legal mainstream, and three, judges that are destroying public confidence in the court's ability to be fair and independent forums to resolve some of the gravest crises that we face in the country. I think that this is going to be one of the top issues for
we have to leave
the
it
next
there.
president.
Kristen Clark, Eric Andela, Asma Khan, Heather McGee, and Alan Minsky, thanks so much. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.